Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Yesterday I told you the story of Korah and his followers. Frankly, I had to move through the story carefully because it's a bit of a confusing time in the Bible story with lots of different characters and things happening. I often find that our story today comes from another confusing time in the Bible story as well. This week we are looking at obscure bad guys in the Bible, and today we will look at Doeg the Edomite. His story comes in that confusing time when King Saul was having fits of mental illness, and he focused his rage and wrath on David to the point that David had to flee, and Saul pursued him all over Israel with his army. Well, it's never easy to be a fugitive. And when he fled, David needed help. By this time, David had gathered a few followers, and they showed up at a sanctuary in a place named, of all things, Nob. David went there and asked the priest if there was anything to eat, and the priest offered him something called the showbread. Showbread was a special bread that was used in the worship center. There were 12 loaves prepared each week, one for each tribe of Israel, and they were presented in the worship center before the presence of God. After a week, the loaves were changed, and the priests were told to eat the loaves. The very strict rule was that the loaves were not to be consumed by those who weren't priests. However, that's the bread the priest gave to David and his followers. It would be a bit like if someone came to the church in hunger and I gave them communion wafers to eat. By the way, later on, this story became an example of how human need can trump rules, even in the Bible. Now, back to the story. David also asked the priest if there was a weapon there. And in fact, there was a special weapon that was being used as an object to remind everyone of the great thing God had done among them. You see, behind the altar, they had the sword of Goliath. The priest gave that to David too. Now the background music shifts to a minor key, because there was someone else there who saw all this. Doeg the Edomite. And the first thing Doeg did was to go tell Saul of all that had happened. King Saul called the priest to Jerusalem and asked him about it, and then when he heard the story, he was enraged. He told his guards to kill the priest, but they refused. So Doeg the Edomite did it himself. Then Doeg killed all the priests from Nob, 85 of them in all except one who escaped, a man named Abiathar. He went to David and told David all that had happened. David felt responsible because he had put the priest in that situation, but then he invited Abiathar to stay with him and to serve as a priest for David and his followers, and that's what Abiathar did. In fact, Abiathar served David loyally for years, and after David became king, Abiathar was appointed as high priest and a counselor of the king. So, now back to Doeg, who killed all those priests. In one way, you can't blame Doeg. He was serving the king whom God had chosen, God's own anointed. In fact, several times in the middle of this chase, David has Saul in his power and refuses to strike a blow at Saul because Saul was anointed king. David knew he was anointed to be king too, but that didn't take away God's anointing of Saul. And that's perhaps where the story comes home to us. Doeg failed to perceive the new thing that God was doing in David. And just like that, we so often fail to see the new things that God might be working among us. We are so comfortable with the status quo, so at ease with what we know in our past, that we are blinded to the future and new possibilities. We are caught in the inertia of comfort, complacency, and well-being, secure in what we know and what has been, unable to see or move to what can be. Doeg's story brings us to a similar place that Korah's story yesterday did. We are called to pray, to study the Scriptures, and to discern with all we are what God might be doing among us. We live in confusing times with few clear answers. As we search for them, may we turn to God. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.